අද්විතීය 200 Mbps ස්පීඩ් එකකින් ශ්‍රී ලංකාවේ වේගවත්ම සහ පුළුල්තම හෝම් බ්‍රෝඩ්බෑන්ඩ් සම්බන්ධතාවය වන SLT මොබිටෙල් දේශීය ෆයිබර් බලවේගය ඔබත් අදම අත්විඳින්න.
හරිම සුදුයි.
Tonight on First at 9, this Monday the 8th of May 2023. Joint Commission. The EU to brief Sri Lanka on new cycle of EU GSP regulation. In politics, SLPP confident of producing next president.
මේ රටේ මීළඟ ජනාධිපතිවරයා බිහි කරන්නේ ශ්‍රී ලංකා පොදු ජන පෙරමුණේ.
UNP says incumbent president will consider governor appointments to UNP seniors on condition.
මම හිතන්නේ එතුමා පක්ෂයේ සුදුසුකම් තියෙන බ්ලැක් මාක් එකක් නැති පක්ෂයට විශාල සේවයක් කළා තිබෙන ප්‍රවීණයන් නම් කරන්න එතුමාගේ අදහසක් ඇති කියලා මම හිතනවා.
GL insists IMF agreement should be renegotiated.
And the fact that Parliament has approved this agreement is in no way an obstacle. It is not an impediment to the revision of some aspects of this agreement.
While the opposition leader Sajith explains his new economic model.
විකල්පය තමයි මැදමාව.
Soon as possible, government aims to privatize the national carrier within a year, says Sri Lankan Airlines CEO Richard Nuttall. Undertaking. Treasury Secretary informs Supreme Court that the government-owned shares of Sri Lanka Telecom will not be divested before 15th of June, assures that the divestment process is legal.
Alliance Finance මෙතුරු රන්නයි සේවාවෙන් රන් පවුම්කට රුපියල් 1,70,000ක ඉහළ අධිකාරමත්.
ඔබේ විශ්වාසය දිනු සෙන්සුරයින් දැන් ළඟම ඇති ෆාමසියෙන් ලබාගත හැක.
This is AdaDerana First at 9. Live from Studio 24 in Colombo.
Good evening and welcome to First at 9. I'm Shanella Fernando in your top stories for tonight. The European Union is expected to brief Sri Lanka on the new cycle of the EU GSP regulation to be adopted between 2024 and 2033. According to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, new GSP regulations are expected to come into effect from 1st of January 2024. The European delegation will give an update on the new regulation at the session of the Joint Commission between Sri Lanka and the European Union tomorrow.
The 25th session of the Joint Commission between Sri Lanka and the European Union will commence at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Colombo tomorrow. The meeting will be co-chaired by Secretary to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs Aruni Vijayawardena and Deputy Managing Director for Asia and Pacific of the European Union External Action Service, Paola Pampaloni. According to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, broad range of bilateral and multilateral issues of mutual interest to both factions are expected to be discussed along with areas of future cooperation. The outcome of the three working groups established under the Joint Commission, namely the Working Group on Trade and Economic Cooperation and the Working Group on Development Cooperation, will also be discussed in detail during the meeting. During the session tomorrow, the European Union delegation will be briefing on the new cycle of the EU GSP regulation to be adopted for the years starting from 2024 up until 2023, which will be effective from 1st of January 2024 for the next 10 years. The Sri Lankan delegation will represent officials from the Ministries of Finance, Economic Stabilisation and National Policies, Justice, Prison Affairs and Constitutional Reforms, Trade, Commerce and Food Security. Further, officials of the ministries including Labour and Foreign Employment, Education, Environment, Defence, Public Security and Foreign Affairs will also represent Sri Lanka. The previous session of the Joint Commission meeting was held in February 2022 in Brussels.
Independent Parliament and member of the Freedom People's Alliance, Professor G.L. Pieris, is of the view that a future government should renegotiate certain provisions of the agreement reached with the International Monetary Fund. Addressing the media this morning, Professor Pieris said obtaining parliamentary approval is no way a barrier to renegotiate the agreement, adding that there is no requirement that Parliament should approve the pact.
Now, there is certainly no legal requirement that this agreement should be submitted to Parliament for approval. It is also contrary to previous practice and tradition. But there was a reason why the government adopted this measure. They were well aware that the implementation of this agreement would be exceedingly unpopular. There would be strong resistance from the people because of certain conditions that are contained in this agreement. Sri Lanka did not obtain an agreement that best suited the interests of our people. Then the result of this agreement is that Sri Lanka loses any authority to make decisions with regard to the interest rates, whether they are to be increased or decreased as circumstances require from time to time. That can only be done with the approval of the International Monetary Fund. So has there been sufficient sensitivity about this? We have to bear in mind how much our people can endure. We do not believe that this was sufficiently addressed in the negotiations that were carried on with the International Monetary Fund. At the end of the day, there is almost no role today in the preparation of this year's budget, which has to be presented to Parliament in November. See, there's only a very negligible role for the Treasury and the Central Bank. There are provisions in the agreement that daily and weekly reports have to be submitted to the IMF. They must approve those reports. So we do not think for a moment that that is a state of affairs that is at all compatible with the independence and the stature of a country like ours. In light of these circumstances, I want to emphasize that there has to be renegotiation of some parts of this agreement. A future government is duty bound to suggest certain modifications and amendments. They must re-engage with the International Monetary Fund. And the fact that Parliament has approved this agreement is in no way an obstacle. It is not an impediment to the revision of some aspects of this agreement.
Former Minister and National Organizer of the United National Party, Navin Desanayake, says the President will appoint suitable senior members of the party to positions of provincial governors. Meanwhile, General Secretary of Sri Lanka Podujana Peramuna Sagara Karyavasam expressed confidence that their party will produce the next President of Sri Lanka.
අපි එක්සත් ජාතික පක්ෂය කවදාවත් බොරු කියන්න බලාපොරොත්තු වෙන්නේ නැහැ. මේ තත්ත්වය තවමත් අපේ මට්ටම අනුව සතුටුදායක නැහැ. තවත් ඉදිරියට යන්න තියෙනවා. අපිට තව මේ පියවරල් ගොඩාක් ගන්න තිබෙනවා. අපි හිතනවා අපිට ජනාධිපතිතුමාගේ වැඩපිළිවෙල යටතේ තවත් දොරවල් ගොඩාක් විවෘත වෙයි කියලා. ජනාධිපතිතුමා දේශපාලනයක් කරන්නේ නැහැ. ජනාධිපතිතුමා කරන්නේ රට ගොඩනගන එක, රටේ ස්ථාවරභාවය ආරක්ෂා කරන එක. ඉතින් මම හිතන්නේ ඒ පසුබිමත් එක්ක තමයි එතුමා ඊළඟ මැතිවරණ සැලසුම් කරන්නේ. ඔබතුමාට රාම්පුකාරතුලට ලැබෙනවා කියලා මට FB එකේ දැක්ක මගේ නමත් සඳහන් කරලා තිබෙනවා. නායකතුමා ජනාධිපතිතුමාගේ සම්පූර්ණ අභිමතය තියෙනවා එතුමාට කැමති කෙනෙක් පත් කරන්න. මම හිතන්නේ එතුමා පක්ෂයේ සුදුසුකම් තියෙන බ්ලැක් මාක් එකක් නැති පක්ෂයට විශාල සේවයක් කළා තිබෙන ප්‍රවීණයන් නම් කරන්න එතුමාගේ අදහසක් ඇති කියලා මම හිතනවා. කවුද කියලා මට හරියට කියන්න බෑ. සත්‍යාතික පක්ෂ අපේක්ෂක රනිල් වික්‍රමසිංහ මහත්මයා කියලා ඒක විශ්වාසයි. ඒක විශ්වාසයි. ඒ ගැන කතා දෙකක් නැහැ. ඒක පොහොට්ටුව වෙනමද එතකොට? ඒක පොහොට්ටුවේ ප්‍රශ්නයක්. ඒක අපේ ප්‍රශ්නයක් නෙවෙයි. අපි හිතනවා මේ රට ගොඩ ගන්න අපිට පොහොට්ටුවේ සහාය ලැබෙයි කියලා.
ශ්‍රී ලංකා පොදු ජන පෙරමුණට ලබා දීපු බලය මත තමයි අද රනිල් වික්‍රමසිංහ මැතිතුමා ජනාධිපති ධූරය දරන්නෙත් මේ ආණ්ඩුව කරගෙන යන්නේ. අපි ඒ ජනතාවට යම්කිසි දර්ශනයක් ප්‍රතිපත්තිමාලාවක් පෙන්නලා ඒ තුලින් තමයි බලය ලබා ගත්තේ. මේ රටේ මීළඟ ජනාධිපතිවරයා බිහි කරන්නේත් ශ්‍රී ලංකා පොදු ජන පෙරමුණේ. අපි එයට එල්ලිපිට ජනතාව ඉදිරියේ ඒ දේ කියනවා නිර්භීතව පක්ෂයක් හැටි. අපි ඔබ කියන ඔබ ඔය ඔබට අසන්න ලැබිච්ච ආකාරයට කුමන්ත්‍රණ තුලින් නායකයෝ බිහි කිරීමක් අපේ පක්ෂය කරන්නේ නැහැ.
Opposition leader Sajid Premadasa requests the parliamentarians representing parties of the opposition to look into how social market economic policies and private entrepreneurship can be combined to create a revenue-generating economic model while ensuring social justice. Addressing a meeting represented by opposition parliamentarians, Premadasa said policy of the opposition is to adhere to a centric stance without being biased towards either left or right-wing economic policies.
A special meeting between leaders of the opposition political parties representing Parliament was held in Parliament this morning under the patronage of opposition leader Sajith Premadasa. However, members of the Jatika Jana Balawegaya did not attend the meeting.
අපිට තියෙනවා ආර්ථික දැක්ම පිළිබඳව අන්ත දක්ෂිණාංශක ප්‍රතිපත්තිය තියෙනවා. එතන අපි නෑ. අනිත් අන්තවාදී දැක්ම තමයි අන්ත සමාජවාදී ඒ වගේම රජය තමයි හැම තීන්දුවක්ම ගන්නට ඕන. රජය තමයි මේ රටේ ආර්ථික ක්‍රියාවලියේ සියලුම කේන්ද්‍රස්ථාන ටික ක්‍රියාත්මක කරන්න ඕන. අපි එතනත් නෑ. විකල්පය තමයි මැදමාවත. මම යෝජනා කරනවා ඔබතුමන්ලාගේ මේ කමිටු හරහා මිශ්‍ර ආර්ථික ක්‍රමවේදයක සමාජ සාධාරණත්වය ස්ථාපනය කරන ගම ධන උත්පාදනය සඳහා අවශ්‍ය පෞද්ගලික ව්‍යවසායකත්වය සමාජ වෙළඳපොළ ආර්ථිකය අපි කොහොමද මේ කරුණු දෙක මුසු කරගෙන ඉදිරියට යන අපේ දර්ශනය තව දුරටත් ෆයින් ටියුන් කරලා ශක්තිමත් කරන්නේ. මෙන්න මේක ගැන අපි සියලු දෙනාගේම අවධානය යොමු කරලා අපි කටයුතු තව දුරටත් ඉදිරියට ගෙන යමු කියලා මම යෝජනා කරනවා.
Arrangements have been made to hold the National War Heroes Commemoration Ceremony on the 19th of May under the patronage of President Ranil Wickremesinghe. This was mentioned during a preliminary discussion at the Presidential Secretariat today under the chairmanship of President's Senior Advisor on National Security and Chief of the Presidential Staff, Sagala Ratnayaka. The National War Heroes Ceremony will be held at the War Heroes Memorial in Battaramulla. The meeting was attended by State Minister of Defence Premitha Bandarathen Tri-Force commanders and the Inspector General of Police and heads of the Department of Security Forces. We'll be back after a short commercial break.
ගොඩමඩ පෙරලි කරන බලපුළුවන්කාරයා මහින්ද්‍රා යුවෝ ටීමෝ වෙතින්. වැඩම ගොඩයි ගොඩම තමයි ස්වරාජ් ට්‍රැක්ටර් ටීමෝ වෙතින්. අත්වා ගැන ඔබත් විමසලිමත් වන්න.
Welcome back in more news. Director General of Health Services Dr. Asela Gunawardena urged members of the public to keep their residences clean to prevent mosquito breeding in a backdrop where the number of dengue cases are soaring in the country. Dr. Gunawardena also informed to consult a doctor at the nearest hospital if dengue symptoms are observed.
During the past week, 1,896 dengue cases were reported from the island. Out of that number, 49% of the cases were detected from the Western Province. The Colombo district reported 405 cases during the first week of May, while Gampar district reported 394 cases. 130 cases meanwhile were reported from the Kalatara district. In this backdrop of soaring number of cases, health experts urge the public to adhere safety precautions to prevent any infection.
විශේෂයෙන් වසනයට පළාත තුළ අපි විශේෂ ඩෙන්ගු මර්ධන වැඩසටහනක් ගිය සතියේ ක්‍රියාත්මක කරලා ඊට අමතරව අපි ගම්පා දිස්ත්‍රික්කයේ තුලත් විශේෂ වැඩසටහනක් ක්‍රියාත්මක කරන්න බලාපොරොත්තු වෙනවා. විශේෂයෙන්ම මට මහ ජනතාවකින් ඉල්ලන්න තියෙන්නේ දැන් මෝසම් වැසි ආරම්භ වෙලා තියෙන්නේ. ඉතින් ඒ නිසා තමන්ගේ ගෙවල් ඉතාමත්ම හොඳින් පිරිසුදු කරලා තියාගන්න, වතුර රැඳෙන ස්ථාන, මදුරුවන් බෝ වෙන ස්ථාන හැකි පමණ සුද්ධ කරලා පිරිසුදුව තියාගන්න. ඒක තමයි අපිට කරන්න තියෙන හොඳම දේ සහ තමත්ම ලේසියෙන්ම කරන්න පුළුවන් දේ. ඒ වගේම තමන්ට උණ හිසේ කැක්කුම නැත්නම් ඩෙන්ගු රෝග ලක්ෂණ තියෙනවා නම් ළඟම රෝහලට ගිහිල්ලා වෛද්‍යවරයෙකුට පෙන්නලා ඒ අවශ්‍ය ප්‍රතිකාර ලබා ගන්න.
In business news, Chief Executive Officer of Sri Lankan Airlines Richard Natal says the government aims to privatize the national carrier within a year. During an interview with Dubai newspaper Khalij Times, Natal said the company is expected to invite bids for stake sale in the coming months. Natal said Sri Lankan Airlines is ideal for an investor interested in more access to India, particularly secondary cities, and perhaps carrying traffic to the east.
Speaking to Dubai newspaper Khalij Times, CEO of national carrier Sri Lankan Airlines Richard Natal said the company is expected to invite bids for stake sale in the coming months as the national carrier has reached break-even and expects to be profitable next year. Natal said the decision will be taken by the state-owned enterprise restructuring unit at the Ministry of Finance. He said the government wants to expedite the process, which they expect to be in months and not years. Natal added that the privatization of Air India took around 4 years, but Sri Lanka would like to do it in quarter of the time if possible. He said some firms have shown interest. In response to a query about India-based Tata Group's interest, he said there is definitely a strategic benefit for airlines that are interested in getting more access to India, particularly secondary cities, and perhaps carrying traffic to the east, considering Sri Lanka's location and the number of flights operated by Sri Lankan Airlines to India. In August last year, the government announced the restructuring of Sri Lankan Airlines by calling on proposals from interested investors for a stake of 49% in Sri Lankan catering and 49% in Sri Lankan Airlines ground handling as a first step. In November the same year, President Ranil Wickremesinghe said several state-owned enterprises, including Sri Lankan Airlines, will be sold to strengthen foreign reserves.
The Treasury Secretary has given undertaking to the Supreme Court that the government-owned shares of Sri Lanka Telecom will not be divested before 15th of June 2023. Further, he has also pledged that the ongoing process of divesting is being carried out through lawful means. Earlier, the Secretary to the Treasury had informed the Board of Directors of Sri Lanka Telecom PLC and Lanka Hospitals PLC that the Cabinet granted approval in principle for the divestment of the stakes held by the Treasury Secretary in the two companies. Accordingly, he had notified the Board of Directors of SLT and Lanka Hospitals that the Cabinet of Ministers granted its approval in principle for the divestment of the stake held by the Treasury Secretary in the respective companies. The companies also announced that they received the approval of the Cabinet of Ministers to sell the shares owned by the government in Sri Lanka Telecom PLC and Lanka Hospital PLC as per the government policy decision. The Treasury holds a 49.50% stake of the issued share capital of Sri Lanka Telecom PLC. The Colombo Bourse ended higher today, helped by financial stocks. The CSE All Share Price Index settled 1.09% higher, ending at 8,926.58 points today. Expo Lanka Holdings and Sri Lanka Telecom were the top gainers on the index, rising 2.4% and 4.7% respectively. Trading volume on the index rose to 46.6 million shares from 12.7 million in the previous session. Meanwhile, the more liquid S&P SL20 settled at 2,593.44 points, rising by 8.01%. The market turnover rose to 885.2 million rupees from 252.4 million rupees in the previous session. Foreign investors were net sellers offloading stocks worth 22.5 million rupees, while domestic investors were net buyers purchasing shares worth 864.5 million rupees. Now let's have a look at how the rupee traded against other major currencies during the day. Oil rose on Monday as easing U.S. recession fears shifted market focus to tightening supplies, offering support after crude prices registered 3 straight weekly declines for the first time since November. A healthy U.S. jobs report for April helped oil to climb by about 4% on Friday, even though labor market strength could compel the Federal Reserve to keep interest rates higher for longer.
Brent crude was up a US dollar or 1.5% at $76.39 a barrel. US West Texas Intermediate crude gained a US dollar or 1.4% to $72.37. Brent had finished last week with a decline of about 5.3%, while US crude plunged by 7.1% even after Friday's rebound. Both benchmarks were down for 3 weeks in a row for the first time since November. Goldman Sachs analysts on Saturday said that concerns over near-term demand and elevated supplies were overblown. A round of voluntary output cuts by some members of the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries and its allies, which is known as OPEC+, are expected to begin this month, and the group is expected to hold its next meeting on 4th of June. Before then, US consumer price inflation figures for April will be focused on Wednesday, potentially influencing the Fed's stance on future interest rate decisions. OPEC's latest monthly oil market report is due on Thursday, providing an updated reading on the demand and supply outlook.
With that, we wrap up tonight's edition of First at 9. Thank you for joining. I'm Shanella Fernando. Have a good night.
For news and information you can trust 24 hours a day, visit AdaDerana.lk.